Ja, guten Tag, meine Damen und Herren. Wir haben heute eine englische Präsentation, weswegen ich sofort von Deutsch aufs Englische umschalten werde. Bitte um Verständnis und ich werde jetzt ganz kurz unseren heutigen Gast vorstellen, Professor Abbott, bevor wir dann sozusagen zur Vorlesung übergehen. Und das Prozedere ist wie üblich, wir haben dann Gelegenheit, ganz normal zu diskutieren, Fragen zu stellen, kritische, positive, wie auch immer. Und danach gibt es wie immer sozusagen eine kleine Erfrischung unten. Welcome to the Hamburg Institute for Social Research. My name is Wolfgang Knöbel, and it is my task, my honor and my pleasure to be your guide tonight during this evening, but also to introduce you to tonight's speaker, Andrew Abbott, probably one of the most influential, but certainly one of the most creative and innovative sociologists of our time. In an era of growing populism in both the United States and in Europe, it has become increasingly difficult to stage political debates which fulfill the minimal standards of a rational discussion. There is a feeling that political polarization between the warring camps has become so dominant that arguments are losing their function and pure emotions and resentment seem to win the day. There are probably many reasons why this is the case. Some of them might have to do with the fact that not only science and above all the humanities have come under critical scrutiny, but also the media, which are supposed to feed public discourse with insights coming from academic circles. In Germany, but not only there, particularly right-wing populists use the Nazi term Lügenpresse, lying press, in order to disqualify everyone and everything they don't like. This obviously concerns expert knowledge as well, with supposedly anti-democratic consequences. But it would certainly be somewhat superficial if one tried to link the social and cultural trends just mentioned only and exclusively to the current over-politicized atmosphere in Western societies. There are probably some deeper roots why the role of knowledge, why the role of expertise has changed a lot in public life. Maybe that sounds somewhat obscure, so I would like to give you a small example that might resonate with the experience of at least some of you. When I was a schoolboy, and that's about 4 decades ago, a school teacher was a person to be respected, someone who knew his or her profession, whose judgment on the behavior and achievements of his or her pupils were regarded as objective or at least not to be doubted. The teacher, at least in Germany, was a person who could, due to his or her authority, strictly separate his or her private life from his or her professional existence. No parent dared to call a teacher at home in order to discuss school matters with him or her. It was the school where these things had to be dealt with. It was the teacher who, with the background of his or her uncontested sovereign knowledge, cordially invited parents to come in order to discuss with them the problems at school. As most of you know, that has changed. Parents nowadays certainly do not hesitate to call the teachers of their sons and daughters at home, even late in the evening, and they feel entitled to discuss the achievements and the grades of their kids, sometimes even indicating that they might go to court if their kids are not treated according to the standards they feel correct. In this regard, they are obviously delegitimizing the professional knowledge of the teacher, if they are aware of it or not. It is not my intention, by referring to this example, to argue that something terrible has happened with our schools. One might also welcome the changes just mentioned as a kind of democratization of a rather hierarchical institution such as a school. Thus, the point is not to offer you my personal value judgments, but only to point to changes which have happened in the field of school teaching. There are quite a few changes going on right now with respect to the status of expertise in many different areas of knowledge production, and with rather huge political, cultural, and social consequences. And there's probably no one else in the world who could use his own expertise in a more fruitful way than Andrew Abbott in order to talk about the change of expertise as is promised by the title of his talk. As I already mentioned, Professor Abbott is one of the leading sociologists of our time, intellectually and institutionally. He's professor of sociology at the University of Chicago and editor of the American Journal of Sociology, the most prestigious and eldest sociological journal. There is no chance to mention all the numerous publications by Andrew Abbott. I therefore would highlight just a few. The System of Professions, an essay on the division of expert labor, published in 1988, was not an essay, at least not in the strict meaning of the word, but a book which immediately became the standard work in the research field on the professions. By looking into the interaction of different professions, by highlighting the interplay and the competition of neighboring professions, Abbott succeeded in establishing a completely new and highly original perspective, which can be demonstrated by the fact that probably no other work is quoted as often as his treatise on the professions. Abbott, coming out of the Chicago School of Sociology, is one of the very few sociologists with a gift of producing brilliant work within the fields of both qualitative and quantitative research methods. And it's probably this gift that allowed him to write many articles on path dependency and social processes, essays that he published in 2 volumes, one in 2002 in a book called Time Matters, and another one more recently in April 2016 called Processual Sociology. I don't know whether one could recommend these 2 books to a general audience due to the complexity and sophistication of Abbott's arguments. But for all those who are interested in how sociology has to deal with the fact that the social is never stable and fixed, there's simply no better reading. To all those who are not really professional sociologists, I personally would recommend Methods of Discovery, a book from 2004, because I read it as an invitation to all those who want to know how innovative and exciting sociology can be. In this context, there's one last thing I want to point out before Andrew Abbott will talk to you. The American Journal of Sociology, edited by Abbott, is certainly a publication made for sociological experts. But, and this is crucial, in the review section of the journal, you will oftentimes find long reviews by a woman called Barbara Callarent, analyzing works published a long, long time ago, reviewing books that even don't look like sociology books, and which indeed are not sociology books. Books such as Euclides de Cunha's Os Setores, the most famous Brazilian novel published more than 100 years ago, or Henry David Thoreau's Walden, published around 150 years ago. This strange woman is writing marvelously intelligent interpretation of these books, focusing particularly on their sociological meaning and content. Needless to say that Barbara Callarent's real name is Andrew Abbott, who in an enormously sophisticated fashion demonstrates the worth of sociological insights to bring to life oftentimes long-forgotten works from all over the world, reviews that soon will be published as a book by University of Chicago Press. I personally have never heard of someone who would dare to publish his reviews in the form of a book. Andrew Abbott does, which again demonstrates his exceptional status and position within sociology. I'm absolutely sure that tonight Andrew Abbott will again demonstrate his skills in analyzing the future of expert knowledge, and that we will all profit from the insights he's willing to share with us. Andrew Abbott.
Thanks very much for that lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be in Hamburg. It's also a pleasure to have a podium that's very tall, which I think I have you to thank for, so I can actually see my text. Since I have only 50 minutes, I'm going to plunge directly into the matter at hand. I'm going to talk really tonight about academic knowledge in the main. So although you've heard about my studies of the professions, I'm really going to focus on the academy, professors, what the future is of professors, and the kind of knowledge that professors develop. So that's the focus. I'm going to argue that historical forces of varying sizes and timescales have combined to create what appears to be a sudden crisis in the nature of expert academic knowledge. Some of these forces are new, some are old, some are long-term, some are short-term. I'm going to try to put them all together so that we can have a general interpretation of what the future is likely to hold. Now let me say first a preamble. I'm not going to talk about a revolution in knowledge, because I don't think there is any revolution in knowledge. The idea that we're in a particularly revolutionary moment in studies in expert knowledge is an ideology of various groups in the knowledge world at the moment who wish to get others to support their particular recipe for the future, which is a recipe that I think has little to do with knowledge and much to do with capitalism. Within academia itself, we hear a lot about innovation and creativity and excellence, but I think this too derives from the kind of mechanical application of management ideologies in intellectual life. To be sure, technological advance is extraordinarily rapid today, but the advance of basic science is much slower. In field after field, we're living today off the science of the past, filling in the footnotes and technological implications of theories like quantum mechanics, plate tectonics, the new evolutionary theory, and cultural relativism, all of which were invented in the first half of the 20th century. Nor is technological change itself actually much faster than it was in the past. In the broadcast media, in personal communications, and in expert academic practices, there have been revolutions with monotonous regularity since Napoleonic times. Let's take broadcast media. There were the new elite reviews in the 1820s, circulating libraries in the 1850s, mass newspapers and dime novels in the 1880s, radio in the 1920s, television in the 1950s, and the internet in the 1990s. That's a revolution about every 40 years. In personal communications, there's the penny postal service and the telegraph in the 1840s. There's the telephone in the 1890s. There's universal telephone service by the middle of the 20th century. And of course, there's cell phones by the 1980s and packet data for your computer on the internet in the park by the 2000s. As for knowledge tools, the kinds of things that are used by professors, the mid-19th century saw the rise of periodicals, abstracts, and indexes. The late 19th century brought Hollerith punch cards for doing rapid calculations. It also brought crowdsourced expert projects like the Oxford English Dictionary. The early 20th century brought national library catalogs, comprehensive periodical collection data. The 1930s bring the statistical revolution. The 1940s bring programmable computers and microfilm. The 1970s bring keyword indexing. The 1980s brought computer searchable reference tools. And the 2000s, of course, bring Google Scholar. In summary, broadcast communications, personal communications, and expert academic knowledge have developed so rapidly that at any time in the last 200 years, anyone who lived a full academic career had at least one revolution in all three of these areas in his lifetime. So our experience today is not really unusual. Now, to be sure, scholars from all of those past periods thought that their revolution was the biggest revolution ever. Now, that could be true only if the changes were exponential, with ever-increasing slopes. And of course, you can easily find statistical evidence of that kind by counting things like the number of books published, or the number of articles that are written, or the number of internet conversations about some topic. But those counts don't actually mean anything. The books we publish today are much less likely to be read. Our articles contain work that no one would have bothered to publish 50 years ago. And our internet conversations are simply replacing the conversations that used to take place in the corridor. Under conditions of continuous transformation, when you count the old units of analysis, now, of course, they appear to be taking off like a rocket. But the expansion is made meaningless because we now have the tools that have turned what used to be great achievements into just simple things that beginners do. So today's explosion of publishing means nothing whatsoever in terms of real intellectual achievement. Now, why we all believe in this mirage of achievement, that's an interesting topic, but I'm not going to talk about that. Rather, I'm going to talk about the changes that are actually taking place in expert knowledge and try to put them together to show how they intersect to produce a peculiar moment. Now, I'm going to talk about those long-term changes under 4 headings. I'm going to talk about the objects of knowing, the subjects of knowing, the results of knowing, and the activity of knowing. Now, that's a non-Kantian order, but I'm going to choose that because knowing is more important for me than knowledge. We define excellent knowledge as whatever it is that is produced by excellent knowing. We don't define excellent knowing as whatever it was that produced what somebody else thinks is expert knowledge. No, we the experts are the people who define what is really good, and our focus needs to be on knowing. So let me begin with, however, with the change in the objects of knowing. That's the first thing. There seem to me to be 2 fundamental changes in the last half-century. The first is a shift from a content of knowledge that's mainly about the natural world to one that is equally or more detailed about the social world. Now, of course, the history of social knowledge, of censuses and tax rolls, it's a long history. But truly effective censuses and taxing systems are creatures of the 19th and 20th centuries. Perhaps more important, the huge expansion of economies from the late 19th century onward has built on an equally massive expansion in financial records, and the expansion of the welfare state is built on a similar massive expansion in knowledge about people who get welfare. Moreover, the second half of the 20th century brought the expansion of consumer credit and of a cashless consumption system based on continuously collected information about what money we're spending. Now, while much of this data has always been passively collected, we now have the computer memories and the algorithms to process it. So to a large extent, it's now ourselves that we know. Now, the second great change is related to this one. As I'll argue at length in a few minutes, our desire to know more and more has led us to a perpetual pursuit of shortcuts to knowing, most especially to the creation of commodities that can know things for us. Summaries, guidebooks, calculators, expert systems, and so on. But as we invent these commodities, we just increase our desire to know even more, for more detail. This ratchet mechanism results in a steady increase in the detail and particularity of the totality of things that we know. Now, to be sure, there's always been too much to know. Renaissance humanists wrote hundreds of thousands of letters, after all. But there is an intense increase in the detail we have about our objects of knowledge today, which results in our kind of decomposing those objects into smaller and smaller things. Thus, the 2 great changes in the object of our knowledge are, first, it's more ourselves and our social life that we know, and second, the race between desire for knowledge, putting it into commodities, increasingly decomposes the objects of our knowledge into more and more specific, specialized things. Not just knowing about me, but knowing about me last year on Tuesday afternoon. Okay, so that's the first thing. That's changes in what it is that we know, the known, the object of knowing. Let me talk now about the subject of knowing, the thing that's doing the knowing. There are 3 important trends here. The first is the rise of what I'm going to call the social knower. In the 19th century, expert academic knowledge was artisanal. It was done by individuals. There were scholarly societies, but they met very seldom. Even in the most advanced countries, certainly Germany at the time, there were only a handful of giant libraries, a few major museums, a few research hospitals, and perhaps half a dozen non-university research institutions. Most scholars worked alone. But the 20th century knowledge knower has become much more social. In part, this reflected the advancing numbers of corporate research institutions, the growth of industrial laboratories, and the university's adoption in the US of a departmental structure brought intensive discussion between scholars into everyday life. Collaborative work consequently spread rapidly through the sciences and even into the social sciences as well. In the humanities and the humanistic social sciences, this socializing of the knower has happened more slowly, but even in these most artisanal of fields, there emerged in the 20th century the diffuse organizational form we call the discipline, which linked researchers into loose communities quite unlike the large research organization with its formal division of labor and its linear operating structure. But the disciplinary form was still a social form, not so much an artisanal one. Now, an important correlative trend is the increasing dominance of social knowing, I might call it group thinking, among our students today, at least in the US. Our students increasingly prefer group-based and supportive environments for learning over individualistic and highly competitive ones. This phenomenon parallels the changes in the expert knowledge world, and much more important, demographic succession. Our students now are going to be us 30 years from now, guarantees that that kind of view will eventually spread into the academic community. Now, although this trend of social knowing seems new, it's worth remembering that so eminent a philosopher as John Dewey promoted social knowing very strongly early in the 20th century. And yet, in the 1950s, American culture drew back towards artisanal solo work. So there may be a cyclical quality, round and round, to this rise of the social knower. Now, the second great change in the knower is the emergence of organizations as subjects of knowledge, organizations as things which know. In the professions, for example, solo practice has drastically declined. Most professionals work in large, multi-professional organizations. The medical center, the architectural and design firm, the accountancy or consulting firm. Applied social research is similarly the province of interdisciplinary teams, economists, physicians, nurses, social workers. The forms of knowledge are actually encoded into the division of labor in such organizations, and thus the organization itself is a knower, a subject of knowing, as much are the professionals within it. The hospital illustrates this phenomenon very well through its complex structuring of care, which is familiar to all of us who have experienced the Kafkaesque world of modern health systems. Such organizational knowers indeed often claim to own the knowledge of their workers, as is evident in the contract clauses that are had by engineers who, if they resign, are forced not to work for a competing firm over a certain period of time because they have proprietary knowledge. But if much of the knowledge of the modern world actually resides, as I've just argued, in the routines, techniques, and divisions of labor of organizations, even more of it resides in commodities, in things. This is indeed the third great change in the modern knower. It's more often a thing than a person. Now, like several of the trends discussed earlier, commodification of knowledge has been common for at least 2 centuries. The stethoscope was once an advanced medical tool reserved for physicians. Now, practical nurses use it. Students no longer memorize arithmetic tables. They push buttons on calculators. Engineers no longer puzzle over calculations. They use computers for numerical approximation. Indeed, the 20th century has brought entire systems of commodified expertise. Inferential statistics are an example. They were commodified into formulas usable by novices within 20 years of their discovery in the 1920s. And by the 1970s, they were embodied in computers programs that could be used by anyone, could push a button. There are thus three great changes in the knower to complement the two I've said in the known. The three changes are the rise of a social knower, who, as I said, that may be a cyclical phenomenon, but it's presently on the increase. Second, the rise of organizations as knowers, something that's happened steadily since the Second World War. And third, the increasing importance of things as knowers, which has been a steady trend for 2 centuries. Let me talk then about my third general area, knowledge itself, the result of knowing. Now, there's one major change here, a change not so much in the quantity of things known, but in their character. Knowledge is increasingly commodity-like. It is itself a thing. Now, part of this change arises from the use of the word knowledge to denote vast quantities of random facts that our society collects, which can now be turned into valuable information by algorithms that can squeeze meaningful results from jumbled masses of randomness. This value potential inherent in any data, no matter how seemingly unimportant it is, turns all data into potential knowledge and thereby imports to knowledge itself the commodity quality that we usually assign just to data. But the main sources of the idea of knowledge as commodity are the commercial and the educational worlds. In the commercial world, there's literal commodification in Marx's sense, the increasing attempt of capitalists to make knowledge into private property. When they cannot own the knowledge itself, they try to charge monopoly rents for access to it, even though the knowledge involved, in the important case of existing scholarship, was actually built by us, the scholars, as a free resource. But that knowledge is, by its nature, common property has not bothered the capitalists who try to turn it into something they can own. But the educational world itself also drives commodification. Commodification in education has a long history. Cramming and teaching to the test were characteristic of 19th century Oxford, for example. But the ease, the replicability, and the fairness of testing commodity content rather than testing reasoning skills, that has driven commodification in education, especially in testing. And the pressures inherent in testing have been paralleled by the commodification of textbooks, which, much to my surprise, turn out to have been mainly written by marketing departments of publishers for the last 40 years. So this drift towards knowledge as commodity has deep roots in the economic system, the educational system, and also increasingly in our students themselves. The most dangerous aspect of this change is its self-validating quality. Because of the rise of commodity knowledge, there often emerge techniques that can very quickly produce enormous amounts of results that are about 80% as good as what we used to have. But the automated technique produces so many results that people come to believe that whatever it is that the results produce is knowledge, is good knowledge. Sheer overproduction turns the output of these machines into the paradigm of knowledge, and we lose contact with our earlier judgments, according to which this is actually not as good as what we used to have before. Again, statistical programs for computers are an excellent example. Widely available statistical packages enable people who have little understanding of the mathematics, the assumptions, the validity issues of statistics. It enables them to write articles very easily, and those articles get published. They're actually not very good articles. I get a lot of them at my journal. But they look like knowledge, even if they aren't, and they begin to define what people think really is knowledge. So let me turn finally to my changes in knowing as an activity. That's the fourth area of trends I want to talk about. Now, the place where I myself confront changes in knowing most clearly is among the first-year students in our college, since every year I teach introductory social thought to a small class of 18 and 19-year-olds. Yes, senior professors do that at my university. For the most part, my students think that knowing something is knowing an internet address. That is, their chief model of knowing is finding, since they've been doing that on the internet considerably longer than they've been in school. They actually define reading itself as a kind of finding. So for them, reading Adam Smith, first thing I teach in the fall, means looking for the 5 or 6 sentences in each chapter that really matter, which they'll then, of course, underline. They don't understand that the rest of the sentences Adam Smith wrote contain the argument and the evidence by which he produces and defends the sentences that they have underlined. For them, reading is simply surfing something other than the internet. It's an exercise in filtering out irrelevancies and finding what matters. They simply do not believe that all that other stuff that Adam Smith wrote is necessary. They don't actually believe in thought. Now, this model of knowing as finding is, of course, correlative with the notion that knowledge consists of commodities, because commodities are things you can find. And typically, since their model of finding dates from early childhood, our students imagine that what is there to be found is facts. So everything is a fact, content. It doesn't matter whether they're looking for the number of lawyers in the United States or the right interpretation of Pride and Prejudice or the central ideas of Karl Marx. They'll think of it as a fact, a commodity, a thing. Their idea of knowing does not include any notion of real argument. If you ask, I ask them for Adam Smith's argument, they give me a list of bullet points. All the items on that list will be things that Adam Smith said. They'll even be important things that Adam Smith said. But there'll be no logical connection between them. There'll just be a list of them. Because they don't think of an argument as a complex logical syntax. They think of an argument as a list. That's because of PowerPoint. You see my PowerPoint. This conception of knowing as finding and of argument as list clearly arise in the fact that the first intellectual experiences our students have now are with the internet. An argument is impoverished on the internet. It's well known that internet pages are optimized at about 6th grade reading levels, and the medium itself of the internet leads you to think that knowing is finding and that lists are the main architecture for knowing. So as long as the internet remains our children's first intellectual food, we are going to have to teach real thought to them quite explicitly. Unlike my generation, they will not learn the skills of real thought passively from reading tens of thousands of pages of prose as youngsters. They don't actually read much. Now, the idea of knowing as finding and of argument as list are parts of a larger pattern. Our children think of knowing as strongly algorithmic. This is not because they genuinely understand the nature of the metropolis or the householder or the Needleman-Wunsch algorithms, to take 3 famous algorithms. It's because they grew up using calculators rather than memorizing multiplication tables. That is, they grew up with commodity aids for thinking rather than having to remember stuff and think for themselves. This algorithmic model of knowing means that they have no model for what I'm going to call associative knowing. Associative knowing is when you read something and you recognize an illusion because you already have the idea of that illusion in your head. In associative knowing, your head has to be full of stuff in order to see interesting things. I can read a blank page and there's all sorts of blue lines because there are ideas in my head which make things automatically hyperlinks for me. You have to have those implicit hyperlinks in your head, facts and notions and memories that function like little hooks to grab onto what you're reading. But our students are unwilling to memorize anything because they say, oh, I can always look it up. I don't need to know anything. I can look it up whenever I need it. So they don't have this model of associative knowing. Now, it's not that they don't know anything. No, they know lots of stuff. They spend their leisure hours trolling the internet, and their minds are full of evanescent information about consumption goods and about their friends' recent behaviors on Facebook. And they erase those memories, of course, all the time, and they're proud of doing so because that makes them au courant. They're at the cutting edge. So they know many things, but most of them are actually transitory and unimportant. They don't know how to do associative knowing. Now, interestingly, this preference for algorithmic as opposed to associative knowing among young people is also echoed by a similar kind of change among adults. In commercial world, in governments, and even in a surprising amount of academia, there's a strong notion that there's basically one kind of knowing, which is more or less that of modern science. Now, it's not indeed science as is actually practiced today. It's rather that caricature of scientific thinking that we associate with logical positivism and a bunch of other philosophies in the 1930s. Even the humanists are drifting towards the digital humanities, taking a scientific approach to forms of knowledge that are in principle unscientific. An excellent illustration of this kind of scientization is the transformation of the discipline of economics from a general and quite profound reflection about the nature of human production, consumption, and exchange into a relatively narrow form of social engineering, which is obsessed with discovering and even enforcing the laws of a very particular kind of economy, and then teaching those laws as scientific truth to tens of millions of defenseless students every year. Now, much of this one-size-fits-all approach to knowledge has been driven by the capture of the social sciences by a governmental task, the task of evaluating the successes and failures of the welfare state, which has pushed the social sciences themselves towards this narrow operationalism. Important also has been what seems to us in the United States to be more or less the suicide of the humanities, which in the US have largely degenerated from broad inquiries about the nature of human culture into eager proponents of a well-meant but kind of silly identity politics of a simplicity that was rejected by the social sciences decades ago. Now, the ultimate symbol of this surrender is the emergence of Google as a major site of scholarship. Now, the Google project actually long antedates the internet. By 1920s, the leaders of world librarianships had conceived the idea of a universal library with a master index. And that's the core idea of Google today. The scholars of 20th century America, however, forthrightly rejected that concept from the librarians, and they pursued their own highly particularistic and associative indexing. Interestingly, we now know from Bayesian probability theory that what the academics did was better math, more effective, and more modern. The academics did the same thing with keyword indexes, which emerged long ago. The Bible was keyword indexed in the 17th century. And they emerged as a general scholarly tool in the 1870s. And you can show, I did it in an article a couple of years ago, that keyword indexes had absolutely no impact on scholarship when they were discovered in the 1870s. But now we have this new technology which once again has brought this project back into existence. We're going to put all knowledge in a big garbage can and give you bad indexes to try to find things in it. So unfortunately, we're drowning in this bad form of knowing. So my first two trends in knowing are first, a move towards a peculiar and limited form of algorithmic knowing among young people, and second, the dominance of a one-size-fits-all concept of scientific knowing among the older people, the adults. Now, my third trend has already made its appearance, the phenomenal increase in the amount of knowing that's done not by us, but by machines. So I'm going to say a few home truths about computers, assuring you first that I'm neither a newcomer nor a naysayer about computers. I built my first hardwired computer under my father's direction in 1960 at age 12. I learned Fortran at 18 in 1967, and I was applying string search algorithms to social data 30 years before Google existed. So, well, 20 years before Google existed. So, I got a long record here. Modern computing has immense power. Now, it's true that the foundations of most modern algorithms are old. Most of the principal major algorithms were discovered in the 1940s. But we now have the machines to do them on a large scale. I've worked in a number of the major sort of areas here, and I appreciate this power very much. But computers are not very good at imagination. Their power at chess and even Go rests mainly on brute force techniques rather than on imaginative ones. They're also bad at the kind of associative knowledge that I mentioned earlier, and they make no use of emotion in thinking, which may well be a flaw. But the successes of computers at producing a kind of highly regular, commodified knowledge have tended to push our conception of knowing itself towards the kind of knowing that computers do best, which is probability-based simulation and iterative search using these random search algorithms. So many humanists expect great things from digital humanities, but it's now more than 40 years since scholars used computational methods to discover the order in which Plato's dialogues were written. And it's more than 60 years since there was a computerized concordance, keyword index to the works of Thomas Aquinas. It's the first major keyword index that was done with computers, was to Aquinas. But neither of those discoveries has had the slightest impact on scholarship and reflection about Plato and Aquinas, because the kinds of things discoverable about them using digital methods are not really of interest to the humanities. We don't care in what order Plato wrote the dialogues, we care what they mean. Computers are not going to tell us that. So the last and perhaps most important of the changes in knowing is the decline of discursive, linearly ordered knowing as a practice. There are two causes of this. I'm going to elaborate this a little more, so I'm sorry if that sounds abstract. There are two causes. One of them is the move towards a group subject of knowing, knowing in groups, which takes shape in oral talk, knowing as talk. Our students spend enormous amounts of time in conversation, even while they think they're studying. And even among scholars, we find that they're writing blogs which are more or less hallway conversation. Now, perhaps that's not so bad. Orality is, after all, the basis of thought, which is an internalized conversation that you have with yourself. Much more baleful is the shift towards visual knowing. This is a very, very long-standing change. Illustration became more and more important as the 19th century passed through print forms. From the unillustrated elite reviews at the beginning of the 19th century, the middle-class triple-decker novels had many illustrations. The penny novels had tons of illustrations. The 20th century's brought the movies. And one has only to see even a good movie of a major 19th century novel to realize the decline in the power of the art form. Movies have their own many and wonderful virtues, but those virtues are chiefly visual, not theoretical. And the subtle complexities of moral judgment, personal conflicts, and social structure that undergird Anna Karenina disappear in the experience of seeing it as a movie in a few hours, rather than living with those microscopic details for several weeks while you read the book. Movies were, of course, followed by television and the internet, and there's no question that these are brilliant and extraordinary communication forms which permit kinds of immediacy that have never before been possible. But despite the claims of Edward Tufte, the leading exponent of the importance of visualization, visual representation does not effectively convey highly complex thought. We would no more try to prove the fundamental theorem of the calculus with purely visual propositions than we would try to convey the moral ambiguities that face Hamlet without using the words. Visual knowing is simply not as powerful a tool of intellect as is discursive knowing. Let me then summarize what I think are the major changes happening in knowing. Those that we see in our children and students are a shift towards social knowing, knowing as finding, and knowing as algorithm. More broadly, the great shifts are a shift towards computer-based knowing and its typical strengths, searching and simulating, along with its emphasis on algorithmic thinking rather than associational thinking. Second, a shift towards a one-size-fits-all model of knowledge that's based on a model of science that's actually been decisively rejected by philosophers of science. Third, a move towards a model of knowing as index and search, but in a situation where we have much larger masses of materials and weaker indexes than we used to have. And finally, a move from complex discursive thought towards the instantaneous facility of orality and visual representation. Okay, so now I've given you a long list of trends. How am I going to put all this together? To assemble all these trends and comprehend their possibilities as they interact and reinforce each other, we have to talk about their temporal distribution, their distribution in time. So first, in the object of knowing, I noted two changes, social data and microscopic detail. Of these two, social data is in large part long-term, irrevocable trend. Nothing we can do will really change it. On the other hand, the problem of microscopic detail is a matter really of our own failure as academic intellectuals to invent intermediate conceptions that can assemble and reflect about this new and hugely detailed knowledge that we have, particularly of our society. So this is just a temporary condition. In reality, it's a welcome challenge to the maturing social sciences. Vis-a-vis the subject of knowing, the knower, I detailed three changes: rise of social knowing, rise of organizations as knowers, and increasing commodities as knowers. So the first of these, the rise of social knowing, has its origins in the emergence of enormously complex problems of knowing, which are usually problems of application rather than basic science. The easy way to think about this, quantum mechanics came from invisible colleges and disciplines. The atom bomb had to be built by a giant organization. That's the difference between theory and application. Big science continued in peacetime because of similar practical complexities, and organizational knowing more broadly arises from the search for efficiency in practice, as the modern hospital shows. As for commodities, that began as a matter of efficiency and accuracy, slide rules, thermometers, computers, and so on. It's now really, I think, driven by the profit motive, because the capitalists have realized that while knowledge cannot be made into property in the minds of individuals, it can be made into property if it's a physical artifact or a certain kind of text. So I think actually the big changes in the knower are actually driven by technology, application, and capitalism. In terms of time, social knowing, as I said, is reversible. It's been reversed before. We'll see if we can reverse it. It's a matter of us forcing our students to start to value knowing as individuals. But as for the drift of knowledge into organizations and commodities, that's a result of stuff over which we have absolutely no control. There's nothing we can be done about it. We can kind of teach our students that Google searches are not very effective, but that's the most we can do. About the results of knowledge, I talked mainly about the embodying of knowledge in patentable commodities and the trends towards believing, first, that knowledge is made up of commodities, and second, that to have knowledge is that. It's a matter of possession rather than activity. I think this whole trend towards a capitalist conception of knowledge is irrevocable for the moment. We cannot stop it, at least within the universities. In part, that's because the universities have moved from the periphery to the center of their societies in the last century. And so the intellectual life that once found a home in universities is being pushed aside by two other things that universities are now expected to do. One, to certify young people for employment, and two, to invent things that can make income. As a result, the institution of disinterested intellectual life could easily move out of the universities in the near future. It only moved into the universities in the United States between about 1900 and 1920, and it could easily move out soon. Finally, this long list of changes in knowing, the move towards algorithmic rather than associative thinking, and the notion that all knowing is science, those are recurrent episodes. Those have come and gone in the history of knowledge, at least in the United States. So scientism of this sort had a big vogue in the teens, in the late 30s, after Sputnik. That's my generation, was all going to be science, was going to solve everything. And again since the 1990s. Every time those episodes of scientism are always succeeded by successful recastings of the social sciences and the humanities into non-scientific terms. We've just seen that happen again and again. So I actually think those things are cyclical. By contrast, the move towards imagining knowing as a matter of indexing and searching, the Google program, that's a century-old program, but it's kind of taken the scholars by storm in the last 20 years, even though they thought it was stupid for about 80 years. In part, I think that's because the scholars have themselves been so woefully inadequate in coming up with answers to changes in what is to be known, coming up with the conceptions to deal with this increasingly microscopic knowledge we have. So I actually think this trend could be halted if we and our colleagues woke up and faced the challenge. Finally, as for the move from discursive towards visual thinking, that's been underway for over a century, and it looks quite likely to continue in the foreseeable future. It's a really central problem for expert knowing, because knowing has been founded on complex discursive argument for at least 5 centuries in the West, dating back at least to the coming of print. And yet our students are, in reality, woefully unprepared to deal with complex argument because they just don't have the kind of print experience that has been characteristic of educated people for hundreds of years in the West. But this is an example of one of those long-term trends that we ourselves cannot influence. We simply have to react to it. So to summarize, the things that I think are long-standing, steady, and irrevocable is having more of our objects of knowledge be social, having organizations and commodities become the key knowers, having young people start thinking that knowledge is discrete commodities, and finally this move towards visual and oral knowing. By contrast, the cyclical trends are, in my view, the drive towards microscopic detail. Yeah, we can respond to that. Much of the drift towards social collective knowing rather than artisanal knowing, yeah, we can fight back to that. And the science as a one-size-fits-all model, we can fight back to that because I think that argument is always self-limiting. And finally, I think that associative knowledge is something that we can also rebuild essentially by forcing our students to actually start having to learn things so they can recognize illusions as they go by. So these are the kind of inevitabilities, and then the things that are cyclical that we can affect. What about the one-time things, the sort of one-time events that may be going on? You know, some of this, I think, is the suddenness and the size of the expansion of big data and all this kind of thing, which just is going to take time for us to develop a serious theoretical response. But I want to close by talking about a deeper one-time problem, which I think is actually at the heart of the whole issue. I believe that the real reason that all these other trends and cycles cause problems in contemporary expert academic knowledge is that they threaten us at a point when our own internal history has reached a turning point. I think that the last 20 years have seen the culmination of our previous strategy for academic knowledge as a general project, for something I'm going to call the 20th century knowledge project. So I think that a great knowledge project was conceived in the last years of the 19th century and then was co-developed with universities throughout the 20th century. I think that project was a massive success, a success that we see in the tens of thousands of brilliant books produced by the world's scholars under this regime of knowledge, and by the astonishing burst of basic science that essentially started off all these practical applications that we're now doing. Now, this 20th century project was not the project of 19th century thinkers like Leopold von Ranke or Louis Pasteur or James Bryce. 19th century knowledge was something different, and indeed, the great 19th century scholars might well have thought that our 20th century project was not as good as theirs, which had higher standards and perfected rigor. But whatever they might have thought, I think that the 20th century project has been a wild success. The trouble is, it's over. We've done what we can do with the regime of knowledge we've had. One of the signs of that is the drift of smart people. They don't come into academia now. Where are they going? They're going into application. They're going to Google research. They're going to the business world. We are unable to attract them because we are no longer interesting enough to command the best minds of the new generations. So the very culmination of our own project has left us wondering what to do next, at a moment when, as it happens, the external world, all of these changes I talked about earlier, is threatening us. So let me tell you this story as I see it. It's mainly a story about the United States because the American universities dominated the academic world in the 20th century, and so it's easiest to tell it that way. So the American academic institutions have the following basic history. After the Civil War, in the 1860s, many Americans made the trek to French, but mostly German universities for advanced education, just as the Chinese are doing in America today. When they got back to America, they realized that the American university, whether it was a small school producing clergymen and occasional aristocrats, or a brand new state university designed to advance learning for the general population, they saw that those institutions would need a complete transformation. They created a new kind of university by grafting a German top onto an English bottom. They married specialist education for graduate students to generalist education for undergraduates. In the process, they democratized the German Research Institute into a department, which was a band of equal professors rather than a single ordinarius and various people under. They also loosened the then new English specialized honors curriculum into a combination of general education and a departmental major. Now, that undergraduate curriculum in the new American institution was loosely organized around an English-style canon of material. But because they had a German top to the university, the people who were teaching had to do research. Well, they did research, of course, on the canon. This meant that the young scholars of America turned to investigation of the new humanistic canon and, on the other hand, to the creation of an equivalent, a more empirical social scientific canon, a way of thinking about social life, but in the same kind of canonical framework. It also was organized around canonical ideas from political and social theory, equal opportunity, those kinds of things, national, period history, cross-cultural comparison. Now, American universities expanded more or less exponentially from 1890 to 1975 with short breathers for the First World War and the Depression and the Second World War. And like all exponentially expanding populations, they were largely made up of young people. The system was therefore creative, hopeful, upbeat, as young people are. But after 1975, there was a demographic crisis. Expansion stopped. Because of that, the faculty got older and older very fast, and the new system had as many senior scholars as it had young scholars. It was this demographic change that touched off the academia-wide decrease in reading and increase in writing that are commonly attributed to neoliberal management. But more important, the end of expansion turned the academic market from a seller's market, everybody got a job, to a buyer's market. No, you had to be really great to get a job. What that meant was a huge expansion of unimportant publication because it was necessary to get a job. My third-year graduate students are writing articles. I wrote the same papers when I was a third-year graduate student. We threw them away. Now they're all published. That, in turn, because of this explosion of publication, it's much harder to read because you don't know what to read. There's so much stuff out there, you can't possibly figure out what to read. That, in turn, is sort of a downward spiral. So many of the things that are considered to be part of the grand crisis in American academia today are, in fact, very simple consequences of the results of the inevitable end of academic expansion. But another important part of the crisis is that exponential expansion had burned up dissertation topics faster than wildfire burns up a forest. By 1963, when we have the first systematic data, there were over 40 dissertations on Jane Austen. There were hundreds on Shakespeare. Indeed, you can read the rise of identity politics as sort of legitimate dissertations merely as an idea to how to find new dissertation topics. You could, because it was great, you could reject all the previous scholarship as biased because it didn't include women or Latinos or blacks or homosexuals or whoever your favorite group is. And so now you could do all the same research all over again. You had to reread Jane Austen and say that Mansfield Park is really a novel about race because Sir Thomas Bertram has plantations in Antigua. So this bought the American humanities and social sciences maybe another 20 or 30 years worth of research. But the problem with this identity politics strategy were several. In the first place, It made the non-cumulative nature of the humanities and social sciences very evident at a time when cumulative science was getting stronger and stronger. For another, it allowed intense politicization, and it established ad hominem argument as a legitimate form of academic argument, which undercut one of the core norms of academic life. For a third thing, it distracted scholars from facing the problem. It just postponed the problem of figuring out a new way to have knowledge. So it concealed from American academics the nature and the prices of their 20th century success. They had created an extraordinary organization, the modern research university, but much of its greatness lay in its perpetual growth. It's just like a chain letter, a Ponzi scheme. And when that growth inevitably stopped, the whole system stopped with it. Moreover, the university became so successful as an institution that the society wanted to do everything, wanted it to evaluate the nation's young, which of necessity imposed standards inimical to academic life, a good example being the grade inflation that pervades all of elite American education. Everyone at Harvard gets all A's. But if the price of success was that the society expected the university to do all things for all people, the more profound problem was internal. By 2000, academia had reached the end of this knowledge project that was founded on canonical thinking, mastery of the basics, and research that was related to canonical topics tied together via disciplinary organization. It had done what it had set out to do, and the collective product of American universities in the 20th century under this project was indeed an astonishing and masterful whole. But it's in the past tense. No one can read more than a tiny fraction of it, and the synthetic tools and problematics that could organize academia around a common knowledge project are gone today. The mixture of canons and digests, collections, that had sustained the loose coherence of disciplines eventually simply fell apart. What did the disciplines do? Well, economics circled the wagons around its canon, but it degenerated into a form of engineering thereby. Anthropology rejected its founding fathers and found out that it really wasn't about anything. History degenerated into squabbles over who was more oppressed than whom. I could go on. The fact of the matter is that by 2000, the 20th century project was all played out, and the strategy that had extended its life for a couple of decades had actually killed it in the end. To put the matter simply, we are at a moment where we must invent a new way of being academic intellectuals. It's not clear what that will be. It's only clear that the old way is at an end. Our scholarly communications consist mainly of unimportant make work. Our managers are rewarding flash rather than substance. Our research tools have descended to the level of worthless keyword searches. Our peer review system is rapidly weakening, almost to the point of being cursory. Many of our disciplinary associations have degenerated into soft-core political organizations. The disciplines themselves are under attack in the universities by administrators who want to create interdisciplines and centers and all this kind of stuff. Self-publishing has become even approved practice. Most of these things are not so much signs of declines as they are signs of the previous success that we had and the fact that that's over and we have to do something new. We've accomplished what our predecessors set out to do. We covered the Western canon with careful scholarly inquiry. We've done thousands of studies of everyday social life, comparative politics, symbolic practices, and so on. What we have not done is to rethink all of this, to digest it, and to use that to formulate a new kind of knowing that can go forward and command the interest of our best young people. Now, they themselves will probably have difficulty doing this task under current conditions in the academic world, both here and in the United States. Since that's the case, it's up to us who are already in the system to figure out a new way to find the money and the backing to back a new project. It's clear that there's plenty of things to be excited about, given the fact that the next 40 years we'll have to come to terms with vast new university systems in India and China. And more broadly, given the growth of the world of knowledge as it spreads to societies that are very far from Western thought in their outlook on life. And in some ways, the very knowledge trends that I've listed present in themselves an enormous challenge. So much of my own work trying to theorize the nature of humanistic knowledge has come from fighting battles over our university's library, of which I was the chair of the library board for many years. And indeed, perhaps the academic knower of the future will need to be a non-specialist, as I am, somebody who can, if I can paraphrase Marx, do mathematical sociology in the morning, ethnography at midday, archival analysis in the afternoon, and of course, critique in the evening. That kind of multi-skill could be the basis of a whole new kind of intellectual order. Of course, it could also be just self-indulgent nonsense, but we'll leave that aside. But the main fact is that the project we have been doing is probably over, and it's over at a time when we're under severe threat from outside. It's therefore a time for profound reflection and decisive action, but above all, for imagination. Otherwise, the kind of knowing to which many of us have given our lives will simply disappear in the next 30 or 40 years. Thanks.